have to manage the risk. And when somebody says you have to manage the risk of another terrorism attack, that doesn't mean you're any less vigilant. It doesn't mean you don't continue to spend money where it's appropriate. But it does mean that you have to accept in the day-to-day operation of America, you do have to accept some risk. That's just the way it is. I mean, I've been pulled aside for secondary screening more times than you can imagine. It's fine. I get a chance to talk to my former co-workers, and that's great. But it's not. And some of them think I'm a plant. What's Rich doing here? I don't know. But if you treat everybody like a potential terrorist, then you're not trying to manage the risk. So it's a mentality that I'm not sure that even as a country, let alone our elected officials, have really understand and appreciate the notion of risk management. You manage the risk if you decide not to put your seatbelt on. You manage the risk if you put an addition on your house and you don't up your insurance. You manage your risk if you decide, heck, with that little allergic reaction last year, a little flu shot, I'm not going to get it. You manage the risk if you're on the 18th tee, the clouds are gathering, the lightning pop all around, but you've got a great round going and you want to finish. You're managing risk. You're managing risk. We need to understand it. And to that point, our efforts overseas, I remember President Bush called me in October, so we've got the 9/11, we got Anthrax, and he called me and we started every morning. We had a session with the President every morning. The President has a pretty much routine. Got in there before 7 o'clock, probably about 6:45, got his briefings, did his reading. Then he had a briefing from George Senator John McLaughlin for the risk, spin the globe, the risk around the world. Then we'd wait for Andy Card to open the door, and I'd see his arm, and then Mueller, Ashcroft, and Rachel go in, and we talk about terrorism. And one of those mornings after one of those sessions, the President said, "Would you stay behind?" Well, I hadn't been there long enough to screw up too badly, so I didn't think I was going to get punished. But the President said, "We got to do something with the borders." Okay, Mr. President, you got anything in mind? Because we have ramped up security at our borders right after 9/11. We brought commerce to a screeching halt. Think about it. It was evidence to me when I went to a General Motors facility in Flint, Michigan a couple weeks later. And here comes the managing the risk part. In this assembly plant, they ordered the seats once they put the chassis on the front end of the assembly plant. The seats are in Canada, Ontario province. It's a just-in-time world. You put the seats in, probably the last thing you do, one of the last things you do in the car. Email it, you need these seats, computer chip on the seats, pick it up, put it on a truck. They either take it across the bridge or through the tunnel into the Flint, Michigan plant. Well, if we have that truck and those trucks backed up in the tunnel or on the bridge, how much work do you think gets done in the plant? Very little, none. So again, as a country, whether it's mass transit, whether it's international commerce, the notion of managing the risk, it's typical, but you have to bring at your borders a balance between security and prosperity. If you believe, as I do, that America's future, our future prosperity and our future security is more dependent, not less dependent, on how we engage with the rest of the world, then you have to be willing to accept the notion that we're going to manage the risk at the borders. That doesn't mean we're less vigilant. We're going to put technology there. I remember when I was secretary, we re-engineered the process at a couple of spots. Just re-engineered. We talked to the private sector and said, well, if your trucks could leave at a different time, we'll put more customs and border protection people there, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of things that happen. But again, it's that risk management. Risk management. And then finally, response to your question about the international, we worked out a smart border agreement with Canada. We worked out a smart border agreement with Mexico. Unfortunately, I thought at one point in time it might be a template because I think President Bush and Prime Minister Chrétien and President Fox had a meeting. They started talking about like this North American hemisphere of security and economy, and nothing ever really materialized after that. But we did a lot of, not just security we were worried about at the borders. And let's face it, the relationship with our friends in Canada is much different than the relationship with our friends in Mexico. It's more sophisticated, it's historic, there's a lot more integration of capabilities, but that never materialized. But we we stayed in touch with our friends overseas who were very, very, very supportive of the new department. Whenever dignitaries come in from overseas, they always made a point to come in and visit. One quick story, a little anecdote. We worked hard, there was a little humor. I mentioned it in my book. It was, I think it was December of 2003, we just had the department up. March of that year we opened our doors. Ironically, we opened the doors March 1st. February 27th and 28th, folks from the National Security Council came to the little team that I had, dropped off a bunch of boxes and said, oh, by the way, we're probably going into Iraq a couple weeks, so button up America. We hadn't even opened the bloody door. But anyhow, so we canceled some flights because there was some really unique intelligence, which later proved to be wrong. But again, that's one of the toughest challenges for our intelligence community. Anybody that's worked there understands and appreciates it. It's not a science, it is an art. But the source was unique. Ironically, the information matched, and maybe it was false information. I mean, we used to go down to the villages and outside in DC, and when I was in Vietnam, and tell them we had all kinds of capabilities which we didn't have. But anyhow, maybe it was misinformation, disinformation campaign. So we decided to cancel some flights. And I didn't go through the State Department protocol, but sometimes you do what you want to do and you ask forgiveness later. So they had a little heartburn, but they got over it. So I told one of our colleagues, you please call the ambassador here, you call the ambassador here. We're going to alert the ambassadors for some of these countries that we want to cancel their flights. Please cancel the flights. It's our judgment you need to do that. Never forget, my friend Asa Hutchinson, who was a great public servant, reported back to me, and he said, well, I got a little pushback. I mean, I was told this is a matter of sovereignty for us. It's comity. You can't tell us we can't take off. You gotta know it. You gotta love Asa. I do. So Asa thought for a moment and he said, you know, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. You're a sovereign country. It's your airline. And we can't tell you can't take off. We can tell you can't land. In the interest of relations, they canceled the flight. Certain things you had to work out. So a couple points I would make to you, if I could, in summation. The real challenge going forward, I think, clearly, is to understand that we'll never understand the rationale. It's not a war against terror. Listen, I don't play that game. Terrorism is a tactic that's been used forever. It's a war against belief system, and we'll never get our heads wrapped around an understanding of their belief system. You just better accept it because they operate that way. Secondly, but you don't be breathless about it. I mean, look what we did under the real threat of a couple thousand missiles pointed at us and a couple thousand missiles pointed at the Russians. And was that threat real? Yeah. Was there an umbrella of nuclear weapons hanging over everybody's head? You bet. Did we deal with it? Yes, we did. And underneath that umbrella of nuclear weapons during the Cold War, we built the biggest, most significant, deepest, most successful economy in the world. So let's accept the threat is real. Let's try to manage the risk. Let's make sure we understand that there are other partners out there other than the federal government who from time to time need to know. So they got to give it to the department so they can share it. Let's remember that we all wear watches. They've got time. So we live in a just-in-time world. Keep looking at your watch, saying, when's Richard going to quit talking? Fine, I'll conclude quickly. But they got plenty of time. They got plenty of time. And so if we try to manage the risk, stay vigilant, encourage more and more engagement of our partners out there, including the private sector, particularly in the technological arena, appreciate that America's got a lot of other responsibilities against other threats, let alone domestic responsibilities to do a lot of things. And go ahead and accept that, and I know this is the purpose of this discussion, but we will need to do it, but we will need to do it in a way that's consistent with our value system and consistent with, which in my mind means consistent with our Constitution and how we have historically operated as Americans. So I'll just share those thoughts with you and see if there's any questions. Yes, sir.
Mr. Secretary, if you were to recommend to Mr. Dent and other new Republicans who may be in the majority in a couple of months, what would you recommend to them now that you've been there, you've seen it, you've had time to sit back and reflect, or maybe you'd say, well, I can tell you, but then I'm going to shoot you later on. But that being said, what would you do to improve on things all the way around?
Well, some may view what I'm about to say is just trying to get somebody to finish the work that I didn't finish, and if that's okay if you do. I felt all along that building a regional structure within the Department of Homeland, this is an organizational matter. You know, FEMA had 10